Thanks, E. Good morning, everybody. Hi. Yep. Brooke. So, Brooke, she does announcements, she sings, she sets up coffee and tables. My goodness, that's amazing. My name is Mike. I want to welcome you to Journey. Hello, if you're tuning in online. Hello. It's a big day around here. It is NFL weekend, a kickoff, and so, yep, we're just praising Jesus that we made it through this dry spell. Okay, 4 of us are looking forward to that. Yep. What'd you say? Let's go. Are you ready? Yeah, I got fancy ready. Okay, no peeking on your phone, bro. Or is that why you're at the early service? Yeah. We're actually changing our service times and moving them earlier just for football. No, we're not doing it just for football. Hey, my name is Mike, and I'm so delighted that you are here. And what we want to do today is we want to start a series of new conversations that we're entitling Followers of the Way. And we spent a lot of time at Journey and obviously in the scriptures looking at who we are individually, right? We are children of God. We are adopted into his family. We are loved. We are considered holy and righteous. We look at a lot individually about who we are in Jesus. We want to spend some time looking at who we are corporately. So much of the mess of our world seems, at least the church's involvement in it, seems to stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are supposed to be in the world. And this word church doesn't help us much because it's been reduced to an hour-long teaching and worship event that you go to. And so we want to recapture sort of the biblical image of what we are together, not just a bunch of individuals who are cheerleading for Jesus, but as a tribe that is united around God's work in the world. And so we're calling this series Followers of the Way. And that was one of the earliest names for Christians. They weren't believers, they weren't Christians, they were followers of the way. And the way of Jesus is the way we are to embody. So we're going to start in the book of Matthew. It's going to be glorious, Matthew 16. You can turn there, look here, fire up your screens. As long as it's not fantasy football, you feel free to look at your phones. It's fantastic. I'm in a great mood today. And I'm alone in that. Evidently, you guys, God bless you. I am delighted to be here. And my college team really got thumped yesterday, and I still showed up, guys. If that's not faithfulness to Jesus, no one cares, I guess. Okay. All right, so Matthew 16. This is a pivotal point in Matthew's gospel. And the introduction of this sentence is a part that we would normally just skip right over. There is nothing interesting here. But as it turns out, there might be. It says, when Jesus came to the region of what? Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples a question. Now, again, in our English Bibles, we all do this. It's like, okay, let's get to the good stuff. But in the scriptures, geography matters. If you ever get the chance to go to Israel, I encourage you to go. It's like going from a black and white picture to a color picture. And you realize all the place names matter and have theological significance to the stories they're involved in. So I want to take 12 painful minutes to talk about Caesarea Philippi. All right? Yes! We're going to look at maps. Now, there's some stuff that is coming that is horribly offensive and gross, okay? And it's not stuff at all we would ever talk about in a context like this. But I need to paint pictures to understand what Jesus is doing here. So I have to paint pictures of how actually immoral this place is. And to do that, I'm going to use words and some concepts that, aren't the normal church sort of fare. So I apologize in advance, but I do think it's necessary. And you'll see why I'm giving this disclaimer in just a moment. Let's find out where Caesarea Philippi is, though. All right, so we got sweet maps. Now, I know you can totally see this way in the back. But if you were looking closely, way up at the very top, there is a red dot. Okay, that blue circle right below that red dot is the Sea of Galilee. And that's where Jesus does most of his ministry before he goes down to Jerusalem to die one final time. And the very top of the map, about 30 miles away from the Sea of Galilee, under that, but approximately, is this city called Caesarea Philippi. And the reason I want to show you a map, even though it's not super clear, is I want you to see that Caesarea Philippi is the northernmost part of Israel, and it's not on the way to anywhere. It's not like Jesus was roaming the countryside and just happened to be going through Caesarea Philippi. If you're going to go to Caesarea Philippi, you actually have to make a 3-day-long trip to get there. All right? That's the simple point I want you to recognize. This is not happenstance, that what he's about to do and where he's about to do it come together in Matthew 16. All right? Makes sense so far? Now, Caesarea Philippi wasn't always called that. It was called Banyas in the ancient Near East. And it was built, the city was built around a seemingly bottomless spring that came up from the mountain, the base of a mountain called Mount Hermon, which in the Bible is kind of an important mountain. It's one of the 3 sources of the Jordan River. In the ancient world, whenever you had a spring coming up from a rock and you couldn't see the bottom of it, you would build a fertility shrine over that place because it was thought that such springs led to a place called Sheol in Hebrew, or Hades in Greek, Hades. That was where the gods and the goddesses lived. That was the underworld, the realm of the dead. And because the land around such water was dependent upon that water for the fertility of the land and the crops and the animals, you would erect a shrine at the source of this spring. And they worshipped, in the Old Testament, they worshipped 2 Canaanite fertility gods, Baal and Ashereth, if you're familiar with those names. The tribe of Dan from Israel settled up here and committed great apostasy in the worship of those deities, because the teaching was that the gods and the goddesses lived in the underworld, and to coax out the fertility gods, you had to engage in fertility things, which I'll leave to your imagination. And as you engaged in fertility rites and ceremonies and practices and great immorality, the fertility gods and goddesses would come up out of the underworld. They would copulate together, and then that would bring water and rain to the land. And then they would go back into the underworld, and then you would engage, you would have a dry season. And so every year, you would have to do this over and over and over and over. Am I giving you a picture yet of what we're talking about? Now, in 330 BC-ish, a guy named Alexander the Great makes the world Greek, and he conquers this area and introduces the Greek god, fertility god, Pan. All right, let me show you Pan. Pan, it's the same myth. He's a fertility god. He's half man, half goat. And Pan is the same sort of thing. He dwells in the underworld, and he has to be coaxed out of the underworld by seducing goddesses called nymphs, okay? Pan is as scuzzy as a character. My Google accountability software was going berserk when I was doing Google image searches. Pan, you would worship Pan by carrying a 6-foot high, erect body part through the city, and then to his temple, and then you would engage in all sorts of immoral acts to invite Pan out. And then what Pan would do is that Pan would come out of the underworld. He would play a flute. Notice, he is seducing a nymph with his flute. That's called the Pan flute. So if you see those late infomercials in the 80s, that was not a good thing they were selling. And the Pan flute, I kid you not, would induce something called panic, which is this extreme state of arousal and terror, so that Pan had to seduce these nymphs. I'm not making any of this up. All right? So as you see pictures of him from the ancient world, he just looks absolutely evil, right? And these nymphs, like his relations with them were necessary for the land to be fruitful. Here's him playing the flute and seducing nymphs to his lair. This is what we think the region of Caesarea Philippi looked like when Jesus was there. All right, I'll zoom in a little bit on it. Obviously, this is an artist's reconstruction, so we're not exactly sure, but there are enough archaeological remains that we can kind of picture this. Now, stay with me for this next part. No yawning, Mr. Fantasy Football. Let's go. This is exciting stuff. On the very left, Do you see that columned building? Okay, it's a column temple. And do you see behind it, do you see a cave that it covers? Do you see that on the very left of the picture? Okay, that cave was where the spring originated from. Okay, that cave was called the Gates of Hades, all right, because it was the place where you entered into the underworld. Josephus, and a Jewish historian, tells us the Jews of the day thought it was a bottomless well, all right? So it was not surprising then that fertility gods were worshipped here, but what was surprising is that how many other gods were worshipped here also. So we're going to work from left to right. Directly in front of the Gates of Hades is a temple to Caesar Augustus. Now, this is unnecessary background, or maybe you think all of it is, but the reason a temple to Augustus was there is that Augustus gifted this land to Herod the Great. Herod the Great died, had 3 sons. They divide the territory between the 3 sons in something called a tetrarchy. This area goes to his son Philip. So the city is named Caesarea, city of Caesar, by Philippi. So not surprisingly, they had a temple to Augustus there in recognition that this land was his gift to them. To the right, all right, do you see that sort of open area between the 2 temples? And there's a little indent into the rock. Okay, those are called niches, which is a very fun word to say. And if you could look closely, this was where Pan was worshipped. Pan was in that large niche, a statue of Pan. And then, you can't tell from this picture, but you will see in a second, there are smaller niches around Pan where the nymphs, statues of the nymphs would reside, or Echo or Nemesis, and there were several that were there. To the right of that is another temple. It's the Temple of Zeus. Scholars debate whether or not that was there in Jesus' day or built later. So we're just going to say we're not quite sure. But to the right of that, there is an open area. Do you see that in white? Okay, there are 2 parts to that open area, a higher stepped up part and a lower stepped down part. All right, the higher stepped up part, how do you worship a fertility god who is half man, half goat? Well, you worship a fertility god by using goats. Okay, this is the awful stuff. And so the sacred goats were part of ceremonial worship. What you would do is the goats would live and be buried in that upper place, and then they would be brought down, and you would have priests and priestesses imitating Pan's seduction of the nymphs publicly. Goats would become involved in all sorts of horrible things. And then you basically had 50,000 people engaging in fertility rites and practices to coax Pan out from the underworld, right? This is about as nasty as you can get. You're thinking, boy, glad I showed up today. Yes. This is what it looks like today, all right? The cave is the Gates of Hades. Now, in 1879, you'll be fascinated to know, an earthquake moved the source of the spring out of the cave. So when you go there today, the source of the spring actually is in front of the cave, and the cave is dry. But that's a bit of a closer picture. So the Temple of Augustus is the ruins of that are right in front of the cave. The cave is the Gates of Hades. To the right is the shrine of Pan. There's the Gates of Hades today, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the underworld. Very exciting. These are the niches where Pan and his nymphs were worshipped. Right, here's a close-up with a pretty flower. This is that's the remains of the Temple of Augustus. Very exciting. This is the remains of where Pan was worshipped, that open area where Pan was worshipped around the niches. These are the remains of the Temple of Zeus. This is where the goats were buried, up in that upper pen. And then, just a close-up in case you wanted to, see it. And then this, all right, so this is kind of my faraway picture. The important thing you need to know, the last bit of information you need to know about this, is that this whole area, because it was built into a rock, was called the Rock of the Gods, okay? The Rock of the Gods was where all of these gods and goddesses were worshipped, where waters came up from the underworld and the Gates of Hades resided. Makes sense so far? Yes. All right, background over. Ladies and gentlemen, we did it. Back to Matthew. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, now, do you have a little bit more background on that's kind of a big deal? So he was intending to go directly there. He wasn't on his way anywhere else. And it is like the Las Vegas of the ancient world, right? I mean, it's Daytona on spring break. I mean, it is like, picture your worst area. This was what this is. And what's fascinating is that Jesus' disciples were all teenagers. Only Peter was an adult. Only Peter and Jesus pay the temple tax for adults later in Matthew. So they're all 15, 16, 17 years old. All right? So these aren't like 35-year-old men in bathrobes roaming around as shepherds or something. These are like, it'd be Robert, our youth pastor, saying, hey, junior high and high schoolers, we're going to spring break in Daytona, and we're just going to find the worst hotel club we can find, and we're just going to camp there. I mean, right? You'd be like, oh, this is interesting. So Jesus obviously isn't here randomly. And then the question he asks, he is asking because he is there. He says, very famously, to his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Jesus said, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And then very famously, Peter says, you are the Messiah, son of the what? The living God. Now, this phrase is not used anywhere else, interestingly, right? I mean, and it makes sense to use it if you're surrounded by a bunch of dead gods. But you, Jesus, are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now notice, and we've looked at this passage before, so I know it's familiar, but Jesus replies, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this is revealed to you not revealed by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and it's a play on the name rock, and on this rock I will build my church. Now let's stop right there, all right? For those of you who aren't super familiar with like a lot of big theology discussions, there's a huge debate over when Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, what he's referring to. So if you're from the Catholic tradition, the rock is Peter. His name was changed to the rock, and I can't help but say that in Sean Connery's voice from a horribly cheesy 90s movie. Some of the oldies get it. I love it. And we learn from later passages in the New Testament that the church was indeed built on the apostles. So in a sense, that's true, absolutely. So the Catholic tradition says Peter's the rock. He's kind of the first pope, and he's the foundation of the church. If you come from a Protestant tradition, the rock is the confession of Peter, that Jesus is the Messiah. And that was what the church was built upon. And we read later that that's true too. Jesus as Lord was the earliest cry of the church. But Jewish commentators often note that there's a third option sitting right there. That there's a third rock that they're sitting in front of. The rock of the gods. They're in the region of Caesarea Philippi. There's this big shrine called the Rock of the Gods, and they say perhaps what Jesus is referring to isn't Peter or the confession, but the place, the most extreme example of wickedness in his world. And that was where he was going to build his church. And if you think I'm sort of making that up, because it could be, well, just notice what Jesus says next. And on this rock I will build my church, and the what? Now, what are the odds? Jesus never uses this phrase anywhere else except when he's in Caesarea Philippi, where there is a physical place called the gates of Hades. So I wasn't there, and Jesus doesn't say he was pointing at the rock of the gods, but I tend to suspect that yes, the church was built on the apostles, and yes, the church was built on the confession of the apostles, but Jesus was in that region with his 12 teenage disciples, 11 of them, and he was there, and this is the first use of the word church in the Gospels. And the first image we get of church isn't of a group of people persecuted and huddled and holding on to heaven. You're holding on for heaven, right? You get a group of teenagers who are socially weak, marginalized. This picture of the rock of the gods, I mean, Augustus was the most famous ruler ever. Zeus had been worshipped forever, right? Pan had been there long before this Jesus fellow. And Jesus looks at these teenagers and says, on that rock, I will build my church. And those gates won't stand up against what I'm about to do. It's not a defensive image of a group of people huddled being persecuted by the big old bad world. The first image of the church is of a bunch of unlikely characters who are weak in their own selves, pledging embryonic allegiance to Jesus as Messiah because they don't even know exactly what that means yet. And Jesus taking that small level of faith with those unlikely people and saying, you will conquer this. That's interesting to me. Right? And what's fascinating is, how does Jesus say he's going to conquer? Well, right after this, he says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and what? Suffer. So all this talk of conquering, right? We have that in Christian circles today. Yeah, we're going to take it back. We're going to march. We're going to do this, right? When Jesus talks about conquering, how does he conquer? Through his death and resurrection. So Jesus takes the most immoral place, gathers a group of teenagers, right? Socially, they have no power whatsoever. He looks at the most wicked place in his world. And it was so wicked that there were later rabbis that said that this area, Caesarea Philippi, could not coexist when the Messiah was in the world. It was that notoriously awful. And Jesus says, I'm going to build my movement there. And he did. Caesarea Philippi is a pile of rocks today, but yet here you are as living stones being built into a temple, right? It's just so weird then when the church perceives itself to be this threatened, marginalized, insecure in the world community that has to rely on political power for us to flourish. The picture Jesus is presenting is of a kingdom that is advancing. It's like a little bit of yeast in a batch of dough. It will infect everything, or a small seed that takes over a whole field. The kingdom is slow, but it is inexorable, and it is unstoppable, and it is unconquerable. Presidents cannot touch this. Pandemics cannot touch this. Economics cannot touch this, right? Congress and Supreme Court can't touch this. In fact, the more it's opposed and resisted, the more it flourishes and spreads. And it's one of those things where we've somehow conceived of ourselves in the world as people who have to fight other flesh and blood people, even though we know our enemy is not of flesh and blood, for our protection and flourishing. And I want to shift that picture to say it's just weird when we're so afraid. I mean, we follow the guy who says he conquered death in Hades, who took 12 teenage kids and overcame Caesarea Philippi. And so the image for us is just, we're all familiar with how awful the church is, right? No one needs to stand up here and say, hey, by the way, guys, the church is full of hypocrites, right? We all know that. We're here. Yes, right? I'm here. No one has to say the church has hurt people. I mean, our social media feeds are filled with the church hurting people. No one needs to tell us the church is petty and selfish and power hungry and greedy. The church reinforces the divisions and the hierarchies of the world rather than calling them into question. No one needs to tell us this. Some of you have been here and you have been damaged by the malpractice of the Christian faith. No one needs to remind us of this. But in our deconstructing, every now and again we do need to be reminded that we are a part of the unconquerable, unstoppable, inexorable bride of Jesus. And that nothing can stop it. All of our greatest collective fears could come true and the church will flourish. This is what Jesus is like. And we see it wrongly because we look for Jesus in the big, in the spectacular, and in the flashy. And all of Jesus' kingdom talk is in the slow, and in the hidden, and in the weak. And so I'm just so hungry. I'm so tired. I am hungry. Yes, I'm hungry. I'm hungry for God. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm just so tired. I have no idea where that came from. I am just so tired of being told that we are an insecure, persecuted people when we are we are a part of something that simply cannot be stopped. And it's so important that we understand the fact that it's unstoppable doesn't mean that we go out as angry activists. It means that we go out as people willing to offer self-sacrificial love. That's how it conquers. The hardest part for Christians, for really serious Jesus followers today, is to believe the way of Jesus actually works in this world. The way of blessing those who persecute us instead of fighting them back and cursing them. That actually works. That's how the kingdom comes. That's how it moves and advances. Actually forgiving enemies instead of retaliating against them. Loving people with whom we disagree passionately over politics. That's how the kingdom comes. That's what it means when the gates of hell are overcome. And my friends, I just need so much practice because I'm swimming in other water. And so I just want to open up for us as we start this series of conversations, the possibility of what it might be like to not be afraid. And that doesn't mean we're naively optimistic. Oh no, it's tough. These are rough days for us. It doesn't mean we're just spouting off cliches of nonsense to each other. No, it means we are full of lament and that there is a place for anger that is appropriate. But it means at the end of the day that we don't have to clutch and grab. The kingdom wins. And that Caesarea Philippi is a pile of rocks today. And here you are. So we just want to take some time to reflect on this. And I don't know, man, I'm super emotional about this. I don't know why. And I'm hungry. So let's eat, my friends. What we're going to do is we're just going to open up time for us to sit in this, right? There are just times you need to stop talking and just start saying, okay, Lord, what? And we have all these creative ways for people to engage, whether it's singing or just sitting and reflecting, or whether it's getting up and there's communion around the room, and all of you, every single one of you are welcome at the table to take the bread and the cup in recognition of this is how the kingdom conquered. You want to know what conquering looks like? Here it is. Right? For others of us, man, the weight of the world is on our shoulders. We have people who want to pray for what is happening in your life. And so we have these wood stations where just take a bit of paper and write, and then roll them up and put them in these slots, and we pray for them. And we've learned so much about our community. Man, we're probably the best looking church community in this area. I have that on good authority. And it really starts with leadership. But even though we are incredibly handsome and beautiful people, the amount of pain in this room is staggering. And so we just want to be super honest. We're not full of naive optimism or empty, shallow, cliched hope. We want to be people who recognize and grow in the recognition. God is good. He will use all things for good. And that in the end, the way of Jesus will be vindicated. And for those of us in the meantime struggling to humble ourselves and practice generosity and kindness and compassion, this is how the kingdom comes. So I just invite you, however that looks this morning. Father, I bless you that of all the images that you chose to give birth to this movement that we're a part of 2,000 years later, you chose this one. It has such relevance for us today and such power, Lord, because I just sit so afraid for the future and so afraid of what's happening. And in my fear, it's easy to label and demonize and hate. And Lord, we just want to call forth all of that poison from our hearts. And we want to be people who live and actually believe that your way of working in the world works. That's how your kingdom comes. We desperately want to be people who are shaped by your Spirit, to look and act and talk like this Jesus. We just don't want to believe. We want to inhabit the reality of Christ in the world. And we need you to do that. So refresh our imaginations this morning, God, we pray. Hear the cries of our heart as we sing and take the Lord's Supper and pray to you. Draw near to us, Father. Amen.